All right, we're here for debriefing in CloudAhoy. It's great to see everybody here looking to improve their safety and proficiency by debriefing. Just real quick, I would like to ask if you have any questions, hold them till the end. We'll either call people out of the audience if they have questions, or you can come on up and talk to me afterwards. Over the next hour or so, I'll highlight some of the capabilities of CloudAhoy and hopefully give you some ideas about how you can use CloudAhoy to help maintain your safety and proficiency. So we'll get started talking about my favorite topic, and that's myself. My name is Seth Richards. I'm a senior software engineer at ForeFlight. I joined CloudAhoy in 2016, and I became part of ForeFlight back in April when ForeFlight acquired CloudAhoy. I'm also a light sport pilot, so we'll actually be looking at at least one of my flights in this presentation. A little bit about the agenda today. We're going to just give a brief introduction about what CloudAhoy is in general. Then we'll talk about how we get our flight data into CloudAhoy. And then we'll look at some practical examples. We'll look at some VFR and IFR flights, and then a couple fun flights, just to show some of the capabilities of CloudAhoy. And then at the very end, I'll tell you all how to get started, how to get your CloudAhoy account set up, and that sort of thing. So what is CloudAhoy? CloudAhoy's mission is to provide data-driven post-flight debrief. Our flight analysis capabilities provide pilots with the ability to objectively evaluate and improve their proficiency and safety. It's currently in use by pilots all over the world, ranging from student pilots just starting their initial training to experienced general aviation pilots to military and commercial pilots as well. We provide segmentation, scoring, and visualization of your flights that allow you to perform an effective debrief in the comfort and safety of your home in your favorite easy chair after you fly. How do we get the flight data into CloudAhoy in order to be able to debrief it? CloudAhoy is able to digest flight information from many sources, including ForeFlight tracklogs. And when we talk about the data sources of each of the sample flights that we're going to be looking at in this presentation, we're going to talk about three characteristics of those data sources. How accurate is the data? The GPS right in your iOS device is pretty good. It's sufficient to provide a great debrief, but if you have an external GPS, like a Sentry, that also provides AHRS data, that's even better. The best, you can pull data off an EFIS, like a G1000 or a Dynon Skyview, and put that data right into CloudAhoy. Then you're debriefing with the exact same data that you saw while you were in the cockpit. The next thing we're going to talk about is richness, and again, that's going back to the EFIS systems. A ForeFlight tracklog will give you position, and if you're connected to a Sentry device, for instance, you'll also get orientation via the AHRS. You get even more rich data from an EFIS, things like cylinder head temperatures, comm frequencies, air speeds. In some cases, we're able to show flap and gear positions. And finally, how automatic is the process of getting data from your aircraft or your device into CloudAhoy? Importing a ForeFlight tracklog is very easy. It takes 2 or 3 button presses in the ForeFlight app, but it's not automatic at this moment. Other solutions like transferring data from your EFIS might require pulling an SD card. Or if you have an EFIS like a G1000 that's supported by AirSync devices, that data transfer can happen automatically from the EFIS into CloudAhoy. And this is just a real quick illustration of the process of getting a ForeFlight tracklog out of ForeFlight into CloudAhoy. At the moment, it's just a few presses on the tablet. We anticipate that sometime in the future, it will be an automatic process. The ink on the contract is still drying, so we're still working on integrating all of the features and fully integrating all the account systems between the two products. So let's start moving into some practical examples. The first flight that we're going to look at is a VFR primary practice flight. I think everybody in here has either probably flown a flight that looks very much like this. You can see here on the right-hand side we have the ForeFlight the CloudAhoy 2D track view that shows us all of the locations where this aircraft was flying. On the left-hand side, you see the list of segments that CloudAhoy was able to automatically identify in this flight. Before we move on, let's talk about those three criteria that we were looking at. Importing track data from ForeFlight is accurate. You're getting good GPS reception from your internal device GPS, or you've got ForeFlight connected to an external device like a Stratus. You're getting great data. It's not the richest data. We're not getting any engine parameters. We're not measuring airspeed. We're not getting that data, but it's still plenty to provide an effective debrief. And it is mostly automatic. With just a few button clicks, you can get that flight out of ForeFlight and into CloudAhoy. CloudAhoy has automatically detected all of the flight segments here. There's no manual entering or dividing up of the flight to identify the segments. Here's an example of a CloudAhoy debrief playing in real time. You can see there in that segments list that we're looking at two 360-degree steep turns that our colleague Drew flew off the coast of the Carolinas. The timeline along the bottom there, it shows where in the debrief we're currently debriefing. And each of these views that we have open and visible at the moment are synchronized in time. So the aircraft position on that 3D track view correlates to what we're seeing from the cockpit in that 3D HUD view. And you can see that in the segments list there on the left-hand side, we have that right 360 highlighted, indicating that's the segment that we're currently looking at. Each one of the segments in that segments list has some specific segment information associated with it. So I've transitioned that right pane there to be one of our segment information views. And you'll notice in the segments list there on the left-hand side that I have selected a final approach into ILM runway 24. That segment information view is providing us with information specific to that segment that we have highlighted. So in this case, we're looking at a graph of altitude and indicated airspeed. Altitude is the solid green line that we see there in that graph, and indicated airspeed is that solid blue line that we see in that graph. You can also note that we have there's a sort of flag in that graph that is showing us the instantaneous MSL, AGL, and airspeed at the point corresponding to where the vertical bar is. Additional information that we're showing in this segment information view for our final approach is the METAR that was active at the time this landing occurred. That's up at the top there. We're also showing vertical speed graphs down at the bottom, so you can see we could expand those sections to show a graph of vertical speed and center line. So that's context-aware information that you're going to want to look at when you're debriefing this particular approach. Each landing that occurs at an airport will also provide information about the touchdown. So here we can see that we're landing on runway 24. It's just over 8,000 feet long, and the FAA has published a threshold crossing height of 48 feet. So we immediately, during our debrief, have that information available directly to us. We can see that we touch down 1,200 feet beyond the threshold, and we have 6,700 feet remaining. Great way to find what your performance characteristics are in your particular aircraft. We provide similar information for takeoffs. We'll tell you what your roll length was, the runway you had remaining at rotation, information like that, information pertinent to the takeoff. You might have noticed in one of the previous slides that I was showing with the segment information that we have a score there in that segment information view. So that's really one of the most powerful features of CloudAhoy. CloudAhoy is able to objectively evaluate your performance in different maneuvers, including visual approaches, such as the approach in this case, instrument approaches, and primary and commercial maneuvers, things like steep turns, chandelles, and those sorts of maneuvers. The criteria that we use to evaluate those maneuvers by default is based on the FAA PPL ACS standards. But those envelopes are configurable via the CloudAhoy envelope editor. So if you want to tighten tolerances or loosen tolerances to make sure you always get 100, you can do that. This landing received a score of 85, and there are multiple components that we use that contribute to that overall score. So we've got indicated airspeed from 500 feet down to 50 feet above field elevation, indicated airspeed consistency, sync rate being within predefined boundaries, sync rate consistency. So when you take that indicated airspeed consistency and sync rate consistency, it's a really good way for you to evaluate approach stability. Center line deviation and touchdown distance from 50 feet AGL. They're color coded, so when you're looking at this, the green, it's probably okay not to spend a lot of time looking at, but as you see orange numbers or red numbers, those are the areas of your flight, of your performance that you want to evaluate and look at so that the next time you fly, you can be that much better, that much safer. And a question that comes up quite frequently is the goal for the CFI assistant to replace CFIs? And the best way I can answer that question is via a quote by a CloudAhoy friend, Nate Weinsaft, who is a CFII MEI up in Bedford, Massachusetts. And no, CloudAhoy tells you what happened. It's up to the CFI to tell you why it happened. And I'm going to go one step forward, and it's up to the CFI to help you get better, right? So CloudAhoy is going to help tell you where you need more work, and you'll work with the CFI to get better. One unique feature in CloudAhoy is our ability to display wind vectors, as I'm showing here on this steep turn that Drew did off the coast. Being able to visualize wind information in this way is really helpful to help understand how the wind impacts your path over the ground. It's a great feature for debriefing final approaches, traffic patterns, and it's especially helpful for students when they're first getting used to understanding how the air is moving above the earth and how that impacts their ground track. We present wind information in CloudAhoy many different ways, and on the next slide I'll show a few more, but again, the wind vectors are one of the best ways to do it. The other thing you'll see here is we have the CFI assistant scoring for this steep turn. And again, these criteria are based on the ACS standards for private pilot. So for a steep turn, we're evaluating altitude, indicated airspeed, heading, and roll. And you can see in this particular maneuver, Drew lost a few points on altitude. He was meant to be between plus or minus 100 feet of his entry altitude. He ended up being 0 to plus 115, so he exceeded the defined envelope there. That's illustrated in this graph down below. There's a faint green box with a dashed green line. And the dashed green line is the ideal altitude. That's the entry altitude of the maneuver. And the green box defines plus or minus 100 feet. And you can see we've highlighted in pink at the tail end where the top of that envelope was violated during the maneuver. Here's some more places that we display wind and indicated airspeed. We have a data pane in the bottom left-hand corner, and that shows a number of parameters at every instance along the flight. So as you're debriefing, as you're moving the current time in the debrief, That data pane will update to show you what the current indicated airspeed is, what your current heading is, what the wind conditions are. We also are showing indicated airspeed in this altitude and indicated airspeed graph. The indicated airspeed is that blue line that we see. And again, we have our wind vectors turned on for this 2D track. We've got the wind down in the data pane area. And in our 3D HUD 3D cockpit view, we're showing true airspeed, indicated airspeed, and ground speed. Now, it's usually at this point in the presentation where folks think back to when I said, this is generated from a ForeFlight track log. ForeFlight track logs can't provide indicated airspeed. So how are we showing that? The short answer is we are able to combine the flight data that we get from a track log with data sources with aeronautical data sources such as aerodrome information, winds aloft from NOAA, METARs. So what we're doing is we're taking the ground speed that we're getting from the ForeFlight track log and we're applying that wind information to it and we're computing a true airspeed. We're then adjusting that true airspeed to give an estimated indicated airspeed. So in general, that calculation is accurate enough to provide an effective debrief. We're able to compute additional information as well. For instance, if you're flying without an AHARS device, so really at that point all CloudAhoy is receiving is position and just position information. We're able to calculate pitch, bank, and yaw, assuming fully coordinated flight. So if you're slipping and skidding, we might not accurately represent that, but we're able to give you a reasonable facsimile in that 3D cockpit view. And of course, if you're flying with an EFIS or some other device that can provide those values that we will calculate, we'll use the actual recorded values instead. So for instance, a G1000 provides wind information for every second of the flight. We'll use that instead of using the METAR data. It provides indicated airspeed, so we'll present that indicated airspeed rather than trying to compute it. Yep, real quick. I'm going to have to double check. I don't believe so. Okay. Yeah. So next we'll look at a VFR training flight. This one is near and dear to my heart because this is my first solo. Are there any pilots from the New England area here? A couple back there. So this is, I was flying in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Portsmouth is, there's a Air National Guard refueling wing station there. That's a 11,300 foot runway. I was flying an RV-12. I probably could have done my solo just on one trip, bouncing down the runway, but they made me go around 3 times. This debrief, the screenshots that I'm going to show in this portion of the presentation look a little bit differently because previously we were looking at iPad screenshots. These are screenshots of CloudAhoy from a web browser running on my computer. So CloudAhoy, you're able to debrief your flights both on an iPad and in the web browser at home on your computer. The source for this flight is a Dynon EFIS. So I was able to, after the flight, put a USB stick in the bottom of the sky view and download the data and then import it. And this is an example of that rich data that we're able to retrieve. So you can see I'm able to plot values for outside air temperature. There's our wind direction and wind speed. I can get things like oil temperature, oil pressure. So that adding that rich data capability to CloudAhoy and having that data available to you in your debriefs will make them that much more effective. I also recorded all of my training flights with a GoPro video camera, and for me, the $1 million feature of CloudAhoy that made me a subscriber before I became an employee is the ability to embed a YouTube video in the debrief. So what you do is you record your flight, you upload it unedited to YouTube, and you can have the video unlisted so it doesn't show up in YouTube search results or anything like that. You can provide that URL to CloudAhoy, and CloudAhoy will show you that video synchronized in time with every other window in the debrief. So we just looked at one landing there, and I'm about to click on another segment, and when I do that, the video jumped to that segment as well. So I can jump to any point in time in the flight, and the video will go there as well. As a student, one of the greatest things about that is I also had an audio interface cable. So I could hear intercom and ATC communications in the video. So after each lesson and before the next lesson, I would go through the debrief. I would go through the debrief and review all of the instructions that my instructor was giving me that I wasn't listening to because I was too busy trying to keep the plane right side up. Another thing I just want to point out here is that the velocity vector, the flight path vector, that green pip in that 3D HUD view. Oh, yeah. So the question was, how did I embed the intercom audio to the GoPro? I purchased an interface cable. So basically, it was a cable that connected the intercom to the GoPro, so the audio was added to the GoPro video. I believe it was a micro HDMI, actually, yes. Yep, no problem. So that flight path vector that we were looking at there, I'll replay this video. That is showing us where the airplane is traveling as opposed to where the airplane is headed. It's really great for debriefing crosswind landings, because if you're properly accommodating for the crosswind, that green pip should stay on the runway even if the nose of the aircraft is pointed to either side. So we'll look at the segment information view for this landing. I'm showing this one because I got a 92 and I think that's totally great. But for a visual landing, again, we're evaluating indicated airspeed, sync rate consistency, indicated airspeed at 50 feet AGL. And again, we have that graphical representation in the altitude and indicated airspeed graph below. And again, this data was generated by a Dynon EFIS, so the indicated airspeeds that we're showing here are actual recorded indicated airspeeds. One thing about this particular landing, you might see over here that one of those patterns is significantly compressed. I didn't fly out as far. The ATC, it turns out at this airport there's a Customs and Border Protection office, and this is an international airport, and the CBP had impounded a Gulfstream G5 because apparently it landed and they found drugs in it. So while I was flying, they were bringing it to an impound area, and ATC said, if you can get on the ground and get to your taxiway, I can get you into the FBO before they start moving that plane and you have to sit and wait for 10 minutes for it on the taxiway. So I turned in early, I pointed at the numbers, but it was a lot different than everything I had ever done with my instructor before. It probably, looking back, it might have been a good time for me to say unable, just because I was so unfamiliar with the process. And what happened was, because my sight picture as I got to final approach was nothing like I'd ever seen before, except maybe in a couple power off 180 practice landings that we did. I saw the runway, and even though it's like 100 miles long, I thought I was gonna fly off the end. So you can see, you might be able to see in this altitude graph that my descent is significantly steep, and then it levels off a little bit. So you can see at the point where I say, okay, I'm okay, there's plenty of runway remaining, I don't have to dive to the ground, my airspeed started to settle into where I wanted it to be. But being able to look back and evaluate that and think about that after the fact, it's a detail that I probably wouldn't remember 5 years after the fact, but because I have this debrief to review, it's something that is constantly in my mind. And just to show a couple more capabilities of CloudAhoy, again, we can turn on the wind vectors here. Really great for seeing why the patterns aren't square, seeing what the impact of the wind on path over the ground is. And then just to show that we do have VFR charts that you can underlay. So if you're doing cross countries, it's a great way to debrief and see the charts in the area that you were flying. So the next flight we're going to look at is an IFR proficiency flight, and it's another flight that was recorded with a ForeFlight tracklog. This flight was flown by our colleague Kate, and she flew from Concord, New Hampshire to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, up to Sanford, Maine, and then back into Concord. And again, this was recorded with ForeFlight using an external GPS with AHARS, so it is accurate, it is not rich, and it's almost totally automatic. You'll also note that I think the lowest score in that CFI assistant area is a 96. There's no question why Kate shared this particular flight for us to show at Oshkosh. So another great feature of CloudAhoy is its ability to automatically detect which instrument approach you were flying. So assuming you are flying close enough to the fixes that make up an approach, CloudAhoy can automatically add the published representation of that approach to your debrief. So that magenta area that you see, the magenta line with the magenta hold there, that's the FAA's published approach. The green and blue, and it's tan, but it's very difficult to see. That was the actual path that Kate flew. And then just like earlier examples, the CFI assistant there in the top of the segment information view gives us a breakdown of all of the components that contribute to Kate's 98. Yeah. So, and again, we're tailoring all of those components. The components that we're grading are tailored to the fact that this is an instrument approach. So you can see we have the magenta line in the 3D track view there. So that, again, is the published approach. We can see the final approach fix is annotated in the view there. And then over in our segment information view, again, because this is an instrument approach, we have a heavy gray line that is the published glide slope for that approach. So we can look at the altitude line of the path that Kate flew, which is the green line, and it is mostly coincident with that heavy gray line. We can also see her airspeed in there. And also in that profile view of the approach, each one of those fixes is annotated. And again, you can drag the slider in that graph and look at the airspeed and altitude at each point in there. Here's a view of, this is the ILS into runway 7 in Sanford, Maine. Again, great score. And another view for the ILS, we're showing the localizer boundaries. And then in the segment information view in the altitude and airspeed graph, we're showing the glide slope boundaries as well. And again, each one of the fixes of the approach is annotated there in that graph. Kate did ask me to point out that she was vectored through, and it was ATC that brought her back. And then finally, we have the RNAV 36 into Concord, New Hampshire. Just like we had the VFR charts in an earlier example, these are IFR low charts. We also have IFR high charts. And again, we have that segment information view that's showing the profile with the glide slope and then the altitude and indicated airspeed graph with the fixes annotated in there. Now we'll just look at a handful of other flights. But before we do that, this is a map that shows every airport in the world that has had a landing or takeoff that has been recorded in CloudAhoy. So we do have users all over the globe. This is a flight through the Alps that a friend of CloudAhoy, Marcus Rex, provided to us. So again, we have that 3D HUD view. Marcus was flying a twin-engine Diamond, and he imported the flight data from the Garmin EFIS in that aircraft. So you can see in the HUD view, we're also showing engine 1 and engine 2 power, G, and then the engine 1 and engine 2 RPM. Over there in that profile view, you might notice all those brown spikes. That's the actual terrain elevation. So we're rendering in the terrain into the debrief, and you'll note that in the data flag up above there, we're showing altitude both in MSL and AGL. This flight was flown by Dan Telfair, who is a decorated Vietnam veteran. He was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam. He has shared that he's had multiple forced landings in his life, including 3 in rotorcraft during the war. But this was a forced landing he had in his home-built aircraft there. He'd taken off from the top of a mesa where the runway was located at his home airport, and he was out flying over the desert, and the control rod for his elevator failed. And he encountered an enormous amount of flutter, and the plane was almost uncontrollable. He was recording the flight with ForeFlight, and he was able to safely land the aircraft down in the arroyo at the base of the mesa after making some aeronautical decisions about whether or not to try to make it back to the airport at the top of the mesa. And actually, Dan joined us here at CloudAhoy a few years ago, and he gave a talk specifically about this flight. Dan reached out to us because the NTSB decided to investigate this. So Dan worked with us and had us provide to the NTSB the information about this flight. And they were able to use the CloudAhoy debrief to rebuild the flight and look at the cause of the failure. And then finally, this is maybe a view that some of you folks had just recently. This is some screenshots of a flight that our founder, Chuck Shavit, took here into Oshkosh in 2013, landing on the yellow dot there. One of the great uses of CloudAhoy is just to relive fun flights. It's not all about debriefing for safety, debriefing for proficiency. Debriefing for fun and being able to relive flights that you've taken in the past is also a wonderful use. So what comes next? You can create an account at www.cloudahoy.com. Again, at the moment, your CloudAhoy account and ForeFlight accounts are separate and distinct. We expect that to change. There's no credit card required when you sign up, so everyone automatically gets 35 days free of CloudAhoy Pro. And then with the show special coupon code there, if you apply that to your account, you'll get an additional 90 days on top of that 35 days. You can import old flights into CloudAhoy. So if you already have ForeFlight track logs in your ForeFlight account, you can import those the moment that you create your account. There's no need to create a CloudAhoy account and then go flying to get flights in. You can also, of course, import existing flights from your MFD, from your G1000 or other EFIS. And then the most fun is to go log new flights. Go do some flying, debrief your flights afterwards in CloudAhoy. A couple other things that I'd like to point out. In the CloudAhoy debrief, we have a feedback button at the top. If you have any questions or any feedback about any one of your flights or debriefs, please use that button and send it to us. We'd love to hear from you. You can also reach out to us to team@cloudahoy.com. Are there any questions? Yes, sir. Yep. Yep. Yes. So the question is, if I have ForeFlight connected to a flight simulator like X-Plane, will the ForeFlight track log recorded from the simulator be debriefable in CloudAhoy? The answer is absolutely. And actually, that's something I do quite often. I'm a frequent X-plane flyer, and I record everything with ForeFlight and then put it in CloudAhoy afterwards. CloudAhoy doesn't know the difference. Yes, sir.
So on Kate's flight, ForeFlight, where she gets vectored through the localizer,
Yep.
I couldn't see on there how that was weighted and calculated.
Great.
Because if that was inadvertent,
Yep.
that would be something that would be used in a debrief
Yep.
as opposed to being vectored.
Sure.
So how did that end up being scored?
Great. So this question is about the flight of Kate's that I showed where ATC vectored her through the localizer and she came back. What was the scoring result of that, and how did CloudAhoy interpret that? For those particular approaches, CloudAhoy scores from the final approach fix down to the runway. So because that vectoring occurred prior to the final approach fix, it did not impact her CloudAhoy score any, but she could see it obviously in that debrief. Okay. Yes, sir. So there is, every flight has a remarks field, so you can type some notes to yourself. We don't have like a write on the, like you're able to do in ForeFlight. Yes, sir. Thank you. Sure. So the question is, can you export a CloudAhoy debrief and specifically a CloudAhoy debrief with an embedded video as a video? And the answer to that is unfortunately no, you cannot do that, but you can share a CloudAhoy debrief. So basically you can click a share button, we will generate a web address that you can provide to anyone without a CloudAhoy account. They can view that debrief and replay it and manipulate it. So if you have a ForeFlight log entry and information from a Dynon EFIS, will the data be merged or combined? And the answer is, at the moment, no. But that is certainly something that we could look at doing in the future. Yes, sir. There is, we cannot import any flight flown before 2012. Yep. Yes. No, there's no practical limit.
Do you have to enter any POH in? And if not, how do you score a climb if you don't know what it should be?
Great question. So the question was, do we have to enter information from the POH into CloudAhoy so that we know how to grade climbs? Most often you do not. So what we do is we ask you to specify the type of aircraft that you were flying, and we have a database of hundreds of aircraft types with their associated V-speeds, and that's what we use to do the segmentation and all of that. Now, with that being said, you are able to override those numbers, or if for whatever reason we don't have the V-speeds for the particular aircraft that you're flying, you can add them to your account yourself. Yes, sir.
Does CloudAhoy have a feature for organizations such as PFOCA?
Great question. Does CloudAhoy have a feature for organizations such as PFOCA? And the answer to that is yes, of course. So a couple different things about organizations in CloudAhoy. So we do have the ability to manage licensing for an organization within CloudAhoy. So if you are part of a flight school or a corporate flight department, you can manage licensing for your organization and assign licenses to your pilots or to your aircraft. And then moving on to the next part of that is PFOCA, so Pilot Flight Quality Assurance. Now you've probably heard about FOQA being used in the airlines. And so FOQA is kind of the next level above debrief. So debrief is giving you information about an individual flight. What PFOQA starts bringing you is information about the flights in your organization in aggregate, the safety of those flights. Are people banking beyond 60 degrees below 1,500 feet altitude? Are they exceeding the maximum airspeed of the airframe? Those sorts of information that would be relevant to a flight safety manager or a chief flight instructor or chief pilot. And we are working to bring that sort of capability down to the individual pilot as well. giving you an easy way to track your capabilities over time. Thank you.
Can I see my flights versus my friend's flights?
Can I see my flights versus my friends' flights? Great question. Not at the moment, but that is something that we are looking to add to the product.
So if you're part of a flight school, can you
Yep.
get your flights specifically? If you're part of a flight school, so there are all these tail numbers, but only these three are mine.
Right, great question. So if you're part of a flight school, there are lots of flights associated with that organization. Can I see just my flights? Yes, that's the default mode. So if you're, let's say you're a student at a flight school, when you log into CloudAhoy, even though you are part of that organization, you're only going to see your flights. But the chief flight instructor, for instance, might have the ability to look at everyone's flights.
If I bought CloudAhoy myself then, and I look up a tail number,
Yep.
will I get all the flights?
No. So if you buy CloudAhoy yourself and you look up a tail number, will you be able to see all the flights? No. So the only flights you'll be able to see are the flights that are actually in your account, meaning the flights that you recorded. Anything else? Yes?
So hypothetically, let's say that you have a CFI who doesn't have complete buy-in with electronic training methods.
Sure.
You really like that CFI. Is there a way to enlist someone who's more versed in that to help go over the results of the flight?
Gotcha. So the question is, maybe you're a student pilot with a CFI who is not completely on board with electronic teaching aids. Is there a way or someone that you can talk to help you debrief your flights in CloudAhoy? That's a great thought. It's not a service that we have available at the moment or anything like that. I don't believe we have a forum set up for anything like that yet, but that is a fantastic idea. Thank you. Yes. Yes.
You actually create very interesting thought. Are you going to have also inputs on how you fly the plane from the mechanical, like, you should climb slower or faster, with the temperatures? Like, provide this type of feedback?
Sure. So we don't have anything to share along those lines at the moment, but all ideas like that are on the table, and that is something that we could implement. Yes, and please feel free to share it with the team. Anything else? All right. Thank you, everybody.